What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. We'll be going over 5 wide receivers to trade for today, looking mostly at opportunity to see who's been underperforming given the volume they've been receiving. We're only looking at 5 wide receivers though, so if you want a complete list across all positions, you can check that out at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. So let's get things started off as usual with the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat: through the first 4 weeks, which quarterback had thrown the most end zone targets? And the answer, surprisingly, is Joe Burrow, and David D'Olivo was the first to get that one right. Today's stat: what defense through the first 4 weeks is allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs? And surprisingly, the answer is not the Falcons. You'd think it is, but it's not. All right, first wide receiver we'll go over today is Keenan Allen. Now, Keenan Allen ranks 2nd in the league in targets, 9th in air yards, but only 21st in fantasy points per game. And whenever I talk about fantasy points per game in this video and all trade videos, half PPR. And then I guess it would be a boost. So if you're in a full PPR league, it's even better. You should be trading for Keenan Allen because he does see a benefit because, of course, 2nd in targets. Guy's getting a bunch of targets, going to catch more balls, better for full PPR. But anyways, 2nd in targets, 9th in air yards, 21st in fantasy points per game. The biggest reason is the touchdowns. He's one of just 6 wide receivers in the top 21 in points per game that doesn't have multiple scores. But it's not because of a lack of volume. Allen has 9 red zone targets and 4 end zone targets. Both of those easily lead to his own team. And in fact, the 9 red zone targets ranks 9th among all players. And the 4 end zone targets ranks 5th. So on average, he should finish roughly in the top 10 in touchdowns scored, which means that he is due for a lot of positive touchdown regression. And if he's going to start scoring touchdowns, then he's about to explode because the volume he's getting is already enough to make him a wide receiver 2, but he'll be a wide receiver 1 when he starts scoring touchdowns. And when you look at his upcoming schedule, it's pretty easy to see that coming. I mean, he gets a matchup with a good Saints defense, but one that's definitely a pass funnel. And when you think about them losing Austin Eckler, it wouldn't just be extremely shocking to us if they went a little bit more pass heavy. Maybe they do definitely like Joshua Kelly, and they are fine with Justin Jackson. So I'm not saying they're going to just throw the ball every play, but would it shock you if the Chargers fell behind against the Saints and then looked at the matchup and said, oh, the Saints are an incredible run defense. They're good against the pass, but they're not elite. They are elite against the ground game. So would it shock you if they went pass heavy in that game? No. And then you look at the next 4 matchups: Jets, Dolphins, Jaguars, Raiders. So even if he doesn't have a phenomenal game against the Saints, which I think he'll have a good game in, then those aren't defenses to fear. So this is probably the lowest his value will be moving forward. And it's not like he's going to be cheap or anything, but he's not going to cost you wide receiver 1 value. And I honestly think he should. I think this was one of the players that we as an industry probably got wrong the most. I'm sure there's other players, but almost no one had Keenan Allen as a wide receiver 1. And at this point, given the volume he's getting, if he starts scoring touchdowns, he's going to be a weekly wide receiver 1, and he's not going to cost you that. I promise you. Next up, we've got a repeat from last week, and that's DJ Moore. Now, he now ranks 14th in targets, 12th in air yards, and he leads his team with 3 end zone targets. But he's only the wide receiver 44 now in points per game thanks to 0 touchdowns. But there are only 32 players with at least 3 end zone targets in the league, and he's one of only 5 of them to have not scored yet. Meanwhile, 44% of those 32 have scored multiple touchdowns. His biggest issue is honestly the catch rate. He's only bringing in 56% of his targets, which is pretty bad, let's be honest, considering especially, it would be bad if he had Sam Darnold or he had another just extremely inaccurate quarterback, someone who has a very low completion percentage. Bridgewater has a 73% completion percentage. So having a 56% catch rate is not good. Part of that is likely due to having the deepest ADOT on the team. You know, if you're getting the targets furthest downfield, then you're much more likely to have a lower percentage of those completed when you compare your production to players who are getting, an ADOT of like 7 or 8 yards. His is a little bit over 12. But it could also have a lot to do with just having a new quarterback. He caught 67 and 64% of his targets in his first 2 years. And so this is probably more of a connection issue between him and Bridgewater. And it is something, if it's that is going to improve as the season progresses. I still believe in more. I believe in his talent. I believe in this offense. And I can promise you, he is not going to cost you all that much. So if you had to spend wide receiver 1 value to acquire him, well, I'd say no, don't do that. But given his performances, given that he hasn't scored, I really don't think that his owners are going to ask all that much for him. And if they're willing to give him up for cheap, then I don't see why you wouldn't at least send an offer for him. Because, next week, he's playing the Falcons. And if you watched that Monday night game, they are decimated in their secondary. Now, I don't know how many of those players are going to return, but they were down to like their 5th, 6th string safeties. They're trying to play linebackers at safety because they have absolutely no one. So if there was a spot for DJ Moore to go off, it's probably this week. And if that happens, given where teams probably drafted him, given that he is seeing a lot of targets, if he goes off against the Falcons, I really think it's going to be a bit before we're able to trade for him again. So I would do that before he does. This was a very similar situation to what I talked about last week with Odell. I said Odell's the type of player who can just explode. And given that he's had a little bit of a down production, given that he's playing such a bad defense, he could explode. And if he does that, then he's the type of player people are going to be like, no, actually, I'm going to hold on to Odell. I now realize that he was just underperforming. He's going to go off at random points. I understand that. That's going to happen with Moore. If he explodes this week, people are going to see an explosion, see he already had one decent game, I believe, in week 2, see where they drafted him, and you're just not going to be able to get him for probably another month. So now's the time to trade for him before that happens. Third wide receiver we'll go over today is Diontae Johnson. Johnson's only played a little bit over 2 games so far this season since he suffered the concussion early in week 3, and then, of course, the week 4 game was moved to week 7. Despite this, he ranks 39th in targets, 46th in air yards, while ranking 50th in fantasy points per game. If we assumed that he had played all 4 weeks, and played the entire game in all 4, then he would still be of value. It wouldn't be, a huge discount or anything, but his targets and air yards are producing lower than his fantasy points, and so he would be a slight trade value. But knowing that he's only really played in 2 games so far, he's a massive steal. He's got 11.5 targets per game in the 2 full games that he played, while ranking first by a pretty wide margin in air yards on his own team. We talked about in week 2 how Johnson had kind of taken over as the top receiver ahead of Juju, but after the concussion, after the bye, he's not really getting as much hype anymore. But he's fully cleared to play now. He's over the concussion. And you know what the icing on the cake is for Diontae? The bye. He's already had it. And so if you trade for Johnson, you get him for the rest of the season. And it might not seem like a lot, but it certainly helps just knowing that you won't need to find a replacement for Diontae. And you can just trust him every week as a wide receiver too. And especially if you target a team that is in need of another position, the most likely need is running back, obviously, with all these injuries and it already being scarce. But if you target a team that needs running back, that has Diontae, and you drafted or picked up a lot of these players that we liked, why not send, a bench player or 2? I love 2-for-1 trades, so give them a bench wide receiver, a bench running back. I'm not promising that's going to get the deal done, but a team that needs a running back is going to value them very highly. And so if you have a backup on your team, or at least a backup for you, not a real-life backup, because you're not trading backup running backs for Diontae Johnson. But a backup for you, maybe your 4th running back, if you're a team that has a lot of running backs, trade him for Diontae, and then throw in another piece to get the upgrade, you can probably get him for cheaper than he's worth. So I would do that. Next up, Darius Slayton. Slayton ranks 19th in targets, 15th in air yards, but only 34th in fantasy points per game. The Giants' offense has looked extremely bad to open the season, But if you remember back to the last 2 weeks of summer, we went over this. I said I like Slayton as a player, and he was the type of player we love targeting in fantasy because he comes with that massive weekly ceiling that we want. We don't really want players getting 5 for 50 every week with no path to extremely high production. You can get 5 for 50 if we think that you're not producing to what the level is you will be, but someone who has absolutely no weekly ceiling, we don't want them as much. But we looked at his schedule, and there were reasons to be concerned. He opened the season playing the Steelers, Bears, 49ers, and Rams. Those 4 teams ranked 3rd, 5th, 6th, and 7th in fewest points allowed, and it's led to the Giants averaging 11.8 points per game, which is just the lowest in the league by a mile. So that's the bad. But there are reasons to be optimistic. First, no team will be this bad for an entire season. Even the Jets are averaging 4.5 more points per game than the Giants, and no one thinks that they're going to average 12 points per game every single week for the rest of the year, right? That's extremely low. That's not going to happen for the rest of the season. They opened with one of, if not the most difficult schedules, and it's going to get easier from this point on. After facing 4 top 7 defenses over the first month, they're going to face only 2 above average defenses for the rest of the season, at least in terms of points per game allowed. And given that Barkley's done for the year and their other skill players can't exactly be relied upon to stay healthy, Slayton should be leaned on more heavily. And again, he already ranks 19th in targets, 15th in air yards, while playing over 95% of the snaps. He's already being undervalued, and his matchups are going to get easier. I removed him as a target from the draft rankings this summer, and my reasoning was simple. It's always about value. We knew that his value was going to drop over this first month. You do not play those 4 teams and just go off in every week. It was very likely he was going to post a few duds, but at the very least, he was not going to have that many explosions. And so the best time to acquire him was not in the draft. It's now. But I wouldn't wait too long because he faces Dallas this week. It's the same thing we just went over, like I said, with Odell. You want teams playing Dallas, you want teams playing the Falcons. And so when someone's not producing very much and then they play Dallas, well, they might produce that week, and so it's very likely that come week 6, you're just not able to trade for Slayton because of his explosion. So trade for him before that happens. Final player we'll go over today is a name from last week, and that's Jerry Jeudy. Would have preferred if he had dropped that long touchdown because then he would basically be free, and it'd be possible he got dropped in places, although that'd be pretty unlikely. But I guess it is possible in more like 10 or 12 team leagues. But he currently ranks 24th in targets, 18th in air yards, and just 47th in fantasy points per game. The good news for Jeudy is that Locke is expected back soon. I record these on Tuesdays, and as of right now, he's like 50-50 to play. But even if he doesn't return this week, he will soon. And once he does, Jeudy's value is going way up. He still hasn't been below 55 receiving yards in a game, which is very impressive for a rookie. And he ranks 1st in air yards by a pretty decent margin on his team. The red zone and the end zone targets have been distributed fairly evenly for this offense, but his 5 red zone targets is respectable. Like, it's not crazy high, but it's not so low that we're just concerned with his touchdown ceiling. Before facing the Jets, they'd played the Steelers, they'd played the Bucs in back-to-back weeks, so it's not shocking that they struggled to score in those games. The one negative is that he does face the Patriots this week. That's obviously a brutal matchup, and if Locke is out again, then it could get ugly for Denver, especially having the game in New England. But this is one of those situations we've talked about in the past. Send someone an offer that is clearly in your favor, that you'd absolutely be fine if they accepted, and just get a feel for what your league mates value him at. What do they send in return? Then, when he likely duds in New England, the value should drop and you can execute the trade after that. Don't be afraid to complete the trade this week if the value is there, because, I mean, you don't have to play him. You can just keep him on your bench for a tough matchup, and then you play him when he shreds the Dolphins in week 6. But ideally, I would say the most likely outcome is value drops a little bit more after this week, going into next week, because he's probably not going to have a great game against New England. And if that happens, that would be the best time to trade for him. But send the offer now and see what you can get. So, those are 5 wide receivers I'd be trading for this week. If you want a complete list of all wide receivers to target, as well as some running backs, then you can check that out at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. But that's the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, how about hitting that like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? Thanks for watching.